Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Goldstone, and in this series we're exploring the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew in light of early Jewish literature. In this second video, we'll take a close look at the first of the so-called antitheses in Matthew chapter 5, which focuses on anger and murder. In the previous video, we saw that the Sermon on the Mount contains 6 different antitheses that align with various laws in the Pentateuch. Each of these antitheses begins by referencing a commandment or authoritative tradition, which the Gospel presents Jesus as challenging or expanding. The first antithesis revolves around the commandment not to murder. Jesus expands this prohibition by condemning anyone who is even angry at his or her fellow, which can lead to being liable to judgment, to the council, or even to the hell of fire. Matthew goes on to provide an example that when you're offering a sacrifice at the altar and suddenly remember that you have an unresolved conflict with another person, you should immediately leave your offering in order to reconcile with your fellow. In reading the first antithesis, we can't help but wonder, why does the Gospel employ the specific example of a person offering a gift at the altar? Is there something that prompts this choice? Looking back to the Hebrew Bible and ahead to early Rabbinic midrashim can elucidate a possible motivation. Let's begin with a relevant verse from the Hebrew Bible, Exodus 21:14. But if someone willfully attacks and attempts to kill another by treachery, you shall take him from my altar for execution. This verse includes a number of elements that remind us of the first antithesis. There's mention of murder. The attacker acts willfully and with treachery, suggesting a strong emotional motivation such as anger, and the attacker is removed from the altar. So already we have 3 points of contact between the first antithesis in the Gospel of Matthew and our verse from the book of Exodus. However, there are a number of important differences between Exodus and the antithesis. For one, Jesus speaks explicitly about anger, while Exodus merely implies an underlying emotion. More importantly, Jesus envisions a person choosing to interrupt a sacrifice in order to reconcile with another person. But Exodus seems to be referring to the ancient custom of clinging to an altar to take sanctuary from harm. Despite these major differences, however, as we move to later rabbinic literature, we find more intriguing parallels. Although the verse in Exodus implies that the potential murderer is grasping an altar to escape punishment, in the early rabbinic midrash known as Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, the scene is re-envisioned. Instead of clinging to the altar, the murderer is now understood to be offering a sacrifice at the altar. This interpretation also appears in some of the Targumim, the Aramaic translations of the Torah. The Targum known as Pseudo-Jonathan translates our verse from Exodus as referring to a priest offering a sacrifice. And Targum Neophiti even goes so far as to suggest that it may be the high priest. These interpretations of Exodus 21:14 align with the first Matthean antithesis, where a sacrifice is being offered at an altar, rather than a person claiming sanctuary at an altar, like we saw in the verse from Exodus on its own. The interpretation of our verse from the book of Exodus in the early rabbinic midrashim offers another connection to the first antithesis. Matthew 5:22 stated that if you insult someone, you will be liable to the council. The Greek word, which is translated into English as council, is Sunedrio. This likely refers to the Sanhedrin, or the rabbinic high court. Turning once again to the Mechilta, we find a comment on Exodus 21:14 explaining that from this verse we derive that the rabbinic Sanhedrin was located near the altar, so they could bring the accused person to justice immediately. The appearance of this term Sanhedrin in both the Gospel of Matthew and the Rabbinic Midrash suggests another link between these two texts and Exodus. Exodus 21:14 and its early rabbinic interpretation have several important elements that aid our understanding of the link between murder, anger, and altars in the first Matthean antithesis. Both Matthew and Exodus discuss murder, allude to aggressive emotions, and mention an altar. The Mechilta brings the mention of an altar in Exodus into line with the Gospel by interpreting the situation as a case when a person is offering a gift at the altar. Finally, Matthew uses the word Sunedrio, or Sanhedrin, and the Midrash interprets the verse from Exodus as teaching that the rabbinic Sanhedrin was located near the altar. These points of intersection help us to better understand why the Gospel of Matthew might have used the specific example of leaving an offering by the altar in connection with the discussion of murder and anger. In addition, Exodus and its early interpretation give us insight into why the antithesis might specifically refer to avoiding judgment by the Sanhedrin. For more details about this particular example, check out my article, Murder, Anger, and Altars, the First Manichaean Antithesis in Light of Exodus 21:14 and its Early Rabbinic Interpretation, in the journal Novum Testamentum.